Hello and welcome once again to our weekly session number 15. I am Mr. Fowler. I'm joined today by Madison, and we are going to discuss a whole variety of things. Let me go ahead and share that screen so you can see exactly what it is we are going to look at today. As part of our session for today, if you have not yet completed your peer review, please make sure that you're doing that. Reach out to a fellow student. If you aren't comfortable doing that, just send me an email and I will provide you with a peer review copy that you can use to complete that activity. We also have a threaded discussion for this week. If you haven't completed that or joined that topic, please do so. Remember that this week's topic is discussing the ideas of whether or not peripherals, games that encourage active movement, are something that we should be working toward, or how effective they are in general. So that's a pretty interesting topic. I've had a lot of input about it already, but there's always room for more. So do not hesitate to combine our efforts with that idea. We're also going to, in this Zoom lecture, talk about the road to self-improvement, which is another theme that's threaded throughout our text. So we're going to go ahead and approach this concept of the idea of self-improvement and how it ties into the heroic journey that we've outlined in the class thus far. Once the class session is done for today, if you still have a few minutes of extra time, I do invite you to visit this video about drafting and revising. It's from the OWL at Purdue Writing Lab, and it's just a nice way to warm up to this concept of revision and help you to remember why we go through the revision process at all. What's it all about? What's the intention behind revision? And then, of course, in preparation for next week, we're going to introduce a new, the final essay project for this semester. And we will need you to advance in the reading for the text, Ready Player One. I'm going to have you read between chapters 17 and 21 as much as you can in preparation for next week's discussion. All right? So those are the basics. I'm also going to, for this session, because it sounds like my audio is a little bit, I just got a message, it's a little bit unstable. So I'm going to stop the video share so that hopefully the audio is improved, the audio quality is improved, because after all, it is the audio that I'm ultimately after in regard to the discussion itself. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about this concept, the road to self-improvement. So if we return to our chart that we discussed in the beginning of the semester about how a story advances in a narrative format, because we do have sort of a fantastical narrative that's presented to us. We even have it delivered in first person through the voice of Wade Watts. We remember that there should be a circle, right? And we cross-divide that circle, and we label the points starting from the top and going in a clockwise motion. We label the first junction 1, the next junction 3, the bottom junction 5, and then the final junction 7. Then we cross that, and we have 4 different quadrants. So then the quadrants themselves are labeled 2, 4, 6, and 8. And each of those points has a movement associated with the steps of the journey. And this, again, is the Dan Harmon story circle, but it is a version originally of the Joseph Campbell myth, which is a movement from order to chaos back to order, or from consciousness to subconsciousness, or from the very real to the very fantastic. So we start with a position of you, meaning the main character. And that character experiences some kind of need. He has a need to win the contest in order to better his life, to bring himself out of the traps of or potential pitfalls of poverty, of hunger, of insecurity. And he needs to win the contest to feel this validation and to put himself into a place where he could benefit from his expertise financially. We also have tied in with that idea the stake of ownership, so to speak, of the oasis. Because in this world, the oasis constitutes a place, maybe the only place left where people can escape from the heavy burdens of reality that have been placed upon them through a series of poor choices that were established by the people who preceded them. Point number 3, go. So Wade embarks on his journey initially by traveling to an underground cave modeled after the Dungeons and Dragons scenario called the Tomb of Horrors. There he defeats the Lich, an arch sort of monster or demon in the mold of a kind of evil or undead wizard. And he does this because he switches positions. He switches from the right to the left on a video game cabinet called Joust. And he defeats Anorak, the Lich. Or sorry, not Anorak, Asarak, the Lich. And as a consequence, he's awarded a copper key. He then travels to Halliday's hometown and goes to a recreation of his childhood home. And he uses the key on an old computer to access a video game. He defeats this old video game. I think it's called the Dungeons of Daggeroth. And upon defeating this video game, he is given access to a portal where he enters the film War Games. And in War Games, he's able to complete the sequence of a new style game called a flick sync, where he moves through the main character repeating dialogue. Not a particularly fascinating idea for a video game by any means, but it is what the challenge is. After defeating that challenge, he is awarded with a Jade Key, which gives him, he's awarded with a clue, which gives him insight into the location of the Jade Key. So at this point, he has completed one version of this heroic cycle. He went into the cave and defeated the challenges, seeking out the copper key. He found it, he took it, and then returned to his life, having become this iconic character, Parzival. As Parzival, he has more access to a variety of options. Specifically, we discussed the fact that he has now worked through the scenario and he has money. He has endorsement deals, and he has an actual cash reserve now that he has been able to build up within the world of the Oasis. Now, that is kind of confusing, and we talked last session about how to clarify that. The reserve of funds that he is awarded for his activities does result in monetary gains that he can access both in the real world and in the virtual space of the Oasis. We had to tease out why that was so, and when we went back to the introduction or chapter 0, we discovered a line that read to the effect that the Oasis currency, maybe if you wanted to sort of equate it with Bitcoin or some other kind of cryptocurrency or electronic currency, had become the most stable world currency in this dystopian future of 2045. That's a pretty far stretch for us to make as readers, but those are the established parameters for the world in which the story is set. So now we find another version of the you. Rather than just being the atypical Wade Watts teenager, he's now Parzival, the sort of internet or Oasis celebrity. And his needs as a character are very different as we begin chapter 15. What are his needs now, Madison? What would you say his driving interest is now? Did you hear that question, or were you just thinking about that?
Yeah, sorry. I would say revenge.
Okay, yes. We find out at the end of chapter 14 that the Stacks, his home for many years, has been destroyed. And while we were debating the idea of last time of whether or not this was actually perpetrated by IOI, later in the novel there's some suggestion that Wade finds evidence to that effect, or at least evidence that satisfies his belief that IOI was responsible. So regardless of what the actual or literal truth is, he is of the opinion that IOI tried to kill him and that they had blown up his house. And in doing so had killed his aunt, that those actions had resulted in the death of his aunt. So now his motivation is revenge. So he's got a little bit of an extra incentive to win this contest and discover the egg, which is to better himself at the expense of IOI and Nolan Sorrento specifically. So if we think about his driving need to be revenge, he must then take a next step and go. And so we find out that throughout chapter 16, he establishes a decision to go by traveling to Columbus, Ohio. Now, Columbus is important because it is the physical location in the real world of both Gregarious Games and IOI. And once he travels there and secures an apartment, he's sort of set up on his own for the first time in his life. And not surprisingly, he gives into, perhaps not surprisingly, he gives into a few indulgences, which we talked about last time in our discussion. So that kind of revs us back up to the fourth component, where he is in search of, or he's seeking after, the Jade Key. So when he completes this element, he enters into level 2. Things become more difficult. So let's talk about this broader concept of self-improvement. Madison, can you think of another text or another example from real life of a character who seeks out a routine in search of self-improvement?
Not really.
Okay. So I have a couple.
Well, I
Yeah. Go ahead.
shouldn't I shouldn't say that. I shouldn't say that. The main character of Keiko Hitman Reborn, that's a manga. I'm
Okay.
sure I'm pronouncing it wrong. Um,
But
Harry Potter,
Harry Potter, if I can focus on that one for
but
just
that doesn't really apply.
well, I would say it does, because he and his friends go on this heroic journey too, and it's this phase of the heroic journey which is sometimes called the road of trials. Um, so, what in what ways, especially in the first novel, in what ways does Harry Potter embark on a routine of self-improvement? So when he leaves the I can't remember the exact address, but when he leaves Privet Lane or Privet wherever and travels to Hogwarts,
Privet Drive.
Privet Drive, thank you. And when he leaves there and travels to Hogwarts, he does go through a series of um, trials, and he meets with friends, sometimes in the form of an instructor, sometimes in the form of an actual friend that he makes connection with. What are some of the self-improvement steps he's forced to sort of consider or take?
Well, when he forces Ron to help him go fight the troll, would that be one? Save
Absolutely.
Hermione?
Yeah, absolutely. He must overcome, right, his initial fear and convince his friends that he has the necessary leadership qualities to confront this very dangerous creature. He goes in search of Hermione because whether or not their friendship is atypical, he is encouraged to reach across the aisle, so to speak, to someone who is not of wizardly parentage, and to establish a friendship. So that's important to him. Therefore, Hermione is an important person in his life. So that's a really good example of how he begins to um, embark on the road to self-improvement. So as readers, some of this for the Harry Potter series, some of these things take a while because we find out in the later installments of that series that his parents had not always made the best choices as when in their younger days, that they had not always been as kind to people as perhaps they could have been, given their substantive standing within Hogwarts. Consequently, part of Harry's earlier rejection of being included in Slytherin is part of the road to self-improvement. He could have been a Slytherin. But he rejects the offer made by Malfoy, and then later he rejects the Sorting Hat's assessment of whether or not he should go to Slytherin, and instead elects to go to Gryffindor. So little things like that, little bumps in the road, sort of help to establish and build up his road to self-improvement. Can you think of any other instances, either from Harry Potter or from another example from life or from literature?
When they hop on the back of the dragon because they're stealing from Gringotts.
Sure, sure.
That's a major one.
Mm-hmm. He has,
And they decide that they're gonna let the dragon go.
yeah, absolutely. He's got to make some conscientious decisions, skirt, the conventions of the law in the world in which he lives, in order to attain a greater good. Yeah, good example. If we transitioned to real life, right? If you've ever had an occasion to read the autobiography of Benjamin Franklin, Benjamin Franklin went through an entire period of self-improvement. He had established a schedule for when he would wake, when he would sleep. He developed an exercise program. He developed a monetary savings program, a program of reading and study that he charted out physically. And he also calculates his success and failure with those various endeavors. You can go all the way back to Marcus Aurelius and talk about the idea of developing a routine for self-improvement. And so this concept within the hero's journey, the road of trials, is a very time-honored idea. And it's also something that we see mimicked around us all the time in everyday life. Now, moving back to our text for a bit, and I know you've read ahead, so we're going to potentially spoil a little bit for readers who are pacing themselves. But by the time this is added and up, they probably would have already read ahead a little bit. So starting in chapter 17, what kinds of improvements does Wade Watts seek out in order to begin his own road to self-improvement?
Well, he sets it up so he won't have access to the oasis unless he meets a certain amount of exercise.
Right. So he creates a lockout scenario so that he can continue to be physically agile as well as mentally prepared. Because after the events of the battle in the Distracted Globe nightclub, Artemis says that they perhaps should spend less time together. And as a consequence, he feels depressed and leads into some bad habits, meaning that he spends a lot of time in the oasis and not a lot of time moving around, and he starts to get immensely out of shape. And he says, this isn't going to help me solve these riddles. It's not going to help me advance in this game. So he takes some time to invest in self-improvement. I want to back up real quickly to around page 174, and this is in chapter 17. So for a while, things are going well with Artemis, and then we get this strange passage on the top of page 175, just before the break, if you have the same edition as Mr. Fowler. And he writes that he had no longer cared that he and Artemis were supposed to be rivals. And he reflects that Artemis didn't seem to either. We began to share details about research. We told each other what movies we were currently watching, books we were reading, and we even began to exchange theories and discuss our interpretations of specific passages in the almanac. I couldn't make myself, he writes, be cautious around her. A little voice in my head kept trying to tell me that every word she said could be disinformation, and she might just be playing me for a fool, but I didn't believe it. I trusted her even though I had every reason not to. And that's a big part of self-improvement, realizing that there are more people in the world than oneself, and there are multiple motivations that those people have. Some of them will help you to advance, and some of them will be to your detriment, right? That is simply how the give and take of life works. You have to be courageous enough to go out there and experience the exchange of information. And we get this theme of sacrificing things incrementally. So first of all, you sacrifice a little comfort to trade off only a little discomfort, but potentially a great partner or a great research partner to build a coalition against IOI and Nolan Sorrento. And then a really interesting note that I wanted to make sure I included during this time. He writes, I graduated from high school early in June. I didn't attend the graduation ceremony. I'd stopped attending classes altogether when I fled the stacks. As far as I knew, the Sixers thought I was dead, and I didn't want to tip them off by showing up for the last few weeks of school. Missing finals week wasn't a big deal since I already had more than enough credits to receive my diploma. The school emailed a copy of it to me. They snail mailed the actual diploma to my address in the stacks, which no longer existed, so I don't know what became of it. When I'd finished school, I'd intended to devote all of my time to the hunt. But now all I really wanted to do was spend time with Artemis. So two really important things happen. I find this passage to be particularly interesting. I know, for example, I breezed past that passage when I read the book the first time, but now I stop and think about that because amidst all of the media coverage that we've experienced in the wake of COVID-19 has been a real appreciation for what high school graduation means. I think there will be a lot of students who will appreciate their college graduation ceremonies more so in the years to come, simply because their high school ceremonies were interrupted. Now, there have been a variety of ways to make this up. I've heard of virtual graduation ceremonies. I heard about ideas that would incorporate a larger graduation ceremony for students who are willing to come back and go through the process next year. But no matter what sort of substitute is developed, I think there is a real strange sensation that went through the class of the high school classes of 2020 because they didn't really receive a final ceremony to reflect on what exactly they had accomplished. Madison, did you have anybody affected in your family or in your group of friends affected by this graduation hiccup?
My cousin is graduating middle school.
Mm-hmm.
Nothing big.
Okay. I was also fortunate. I've got a nephew and a niece, both who are going to graduate this year. So they were juniors in high school. And they didn't have to deal with this. They had some friends, of course, who were in the grade just ahead of them. And it was really weird. There were no graduation parties. There was no graduation ceremony. And I love this passage in the book where he says essentially the graduation diploma was emailed to me, or a notification that I graduated was emailed, and the actual physical copy was mailed to an address. And I believe that is what happened, at least in my neck of the woods. So I'm curious about students' reactions to this. Do you think this is something, that would ever become normal in any regard? Obviously, we're hoping for an end to COVID-19 and a return to normalcy, a return to the standard school day, but it raises a lot of questions about what is absolutely necessary for education. And some questions have been raised about what parts of the typical American school day are actually relevant and necessary to the educational process. Do you ever foresee a time where you think...
A whole lot.
Yeah, go ahead.
I was gonna say a whole lot less is necessary than what people seem to think.
Mhm. Do you ever think it'll become normalized that, diplomas will be issued via the mail, um, or do you think there's always going to be a need to celebrate that accomplishment in a time when it's safe?
Well, I'd like to point out that okay, so my sister graduated college last year,
Mm-hmm.
and the diploma came in the mail.
Yeah.
She walked and everything, but the diploma came in the mail. So
Mhm.
she didn't have it when she walked. They literally just handed out, like, the folders
Yeah.
for everybody, and then you got the diploma later.
Yeah. And that's how it happened even in high school for me.
So,
Older.
yeah, the same for me. We got a folder. It was not mailed to us. You walked, you got your empty folder, and then you afterwards, when you were returning your robe, because we didn't buy them, we rented them. When you returned your robe in, you then got your actual diploma.
Yeah.
So, I mean, meh.
Yeah.
I'm not entirely like okay, yeah, I know quite a few people, neighbors and things, that had parties.
Mm-hmm.
Like, they had barbecues and things after the fact.
Mm-hmm.
Like, my cousin's having a party.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but yeah, I mean, I don't quite understand the point of walking.
Fair enough.
So,
But one thing, if I'm going to just quickly play devil's advocate here, that I think is important to remember is that you and I did have the option. Probably all of the students in this class had that option, and we were able to go through that process. So yeah, it's a little bit humdrum once you've done it, but I think especially for um, high school graduation, that going through the physical pomp and circumstance is critical for the student, and if nothing, if for no one else, I think it's important for the the parents who are involved. I think they get a sense of pride and success in life too.
well, right, and I think part of the fact that Wade no longer has any family,
Right, right. It
the
helps.
graduation isn't necessary. Yeah, the graduation isn't for you, it's for everybody else. So,
I think it's certainly become a function of society as opposed to maybe a validation of individual student merit now. And I think you raise a really good point, which is that Wade is sort of less focused on high school graduation because he has no one else to appreciate it. So to him, it's an empty certification. Um, and he now has enough social mobility to pursue his own interests. And unfortunately for him, or fortunately, if depending on your perspective, he has shifted his priority from the contest to Artemis. So he has entered a more adult phase of his life in terms of his own interests and pursuits. So I thought that was just particularly interesting in light of the COVID-19 epidemic and how the graduation ceremony was sort of done via mail and email and sort of fell by the wayside. And I would hate to see that happen, but I could potentially foresee it happening. So anyway, I found that to be very interesting. He and Artemis begin to spend more time together. And then we have this kind of rushed breakup or the dissolvement of their potential friendship or romantic relationship as things advance in chapter 18. And we come back, we get a nice callback to the parable of the cave. We talked about this last time in some detail. And then in chapter 19, we talked about this also. He begins to develop a routine that keeps him invested in his physical appearance and his physical ability, which is ironic and fortunate, because the next set of challenges that he must face are of a physical nature. He at first tries to fill the void with Artemis's the void of Artemis's leaving by filling it with objects. We have a lot of details starting around page 192 of just how sophisticated his rig, his computer setup is. And this is interesting to an effect only because these details are very explicit and very concerned with the explanation of how all of these components function. But they're all fictitious. They may be based to some degree or other on real or extant technology, but there's a lot of text that is eaten up here, if I can actually criticize Ernest Cline a little bit. He is burning up a lot of time on describing technology that's not real. And then on page 193, you mentioned this last time, he purchases an ACHD, anatomically correct haptic doll that's basically a sex doll that is to sort of fill the physical void in his life. And so that was kind of interesting. But if anything, yes, go ahead.
So, okay, so I have a bunch of friends who are nerds.
Mm-hmm.
We're nerdy friends, we're geeks. I liked that section because it spoke to him being the geeky, nerdy person that, like, I have as friends. Because all my friends talk about, like, their computers and their processors, and, like, people have built computers themselves.
Mm-hmm.
So how much RAM does it have? Which processors? Which graphic cards? And I think that's important to note what I know it's from the past, but he's, like, reminiscing about it. Like, people talk about, oh, yeah, I used to have an N64 and it was so cool and advanced for its time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and
He's getting nerdy.
Mm-hmm. And you can see this kind of appreciation in other aspects of collector culture. So, for example, if you think about automobile collector culture, it would not be perhaps out of question or out of the realm of someone to describe, a car that had a 442 block engine with 4 on the floor or something like that. So it's a little bit of, I think that's a good point that you raised. He's showcasing a little bit of pride in what he was able to accomplish and appreciation for the technology that was extant in the time period. I hadn't considered that. That's a really good point. His writing is not necessarily based in 2045 where the story takes place, but it's even from a place even further into the future. So some of this could be reminiscent of how cool things were back when he's remembering this story, as opposed to the way things operate now. So there is that level
Right,
of,
because the
yeah,
entire
go ahead.
right, because the entirety of like the Oasis is Halliday reminiscing about what he enjoyed and loved.
Hmm.
And so he's, it's a parallel to the Oasis and Halliday making it everything he's loved.
Hmm. Yeah, that's a really good point that I hadn't considered. This is maybe this gives a little bit more insight as to why Klein decided to spend this much time on the material as an author, because I sometimes I lose track of that thread when I'm reading. This is Wade's reminiscence, so there's an echo effect, just as Halliday has a great love and appreciation for nostalgia of the 1980s. Wade, in retelling his own story, would perhaps similarly express a love of the nostalgia for 2045 from wherever he is writing this as a reflection of his own past. That's a really interesting effect that I hadn't thought about in relationship to these chapters. That's a good insight. Nicely done there. So we get into this other theme around page 196 of his additional physical regimen that he engages in. And then when we get to chapter 20, something, again, just a little beat that's easy to miss. But this whole chapter unfolds 6 months later. So we really get the extension of time here. And it's just a short beat on page 200. He writes that my avatar slowly materialized in front of the control panel in my Stronghold's command center, the same spot where I'd been sitting the night before, engaged in my evening ritual of staring blankly at the quatrain until I drifted off to sleep and the system logged me out. Again, just as a quick side note, that quatrain is in reference to the Jade Key, and it's pretty standard. I'll find it. It reads, the captain conceals the Jade Key in a dwelling long neglected, but you can only blow the whistle once the trophies are all collected. And he continues on page 200, saying that I've been staring at the damn thing for almost 6 months now, and I still hadn't been able to decipher it. No one had. So after 6 months, we realized that the difficulty of this next quatrain really has been putting the screws to the Gunters and to the Sixers, the IOI Sixers alike. He finds that the passage is a little bit more difficult this time around, and I have to say that I found a little bit of a connection between this novel and a film called The Pirates of Silicon Valley. Have you ever had a chance to see this film, Madison?
No.
It was a TNT made for a television film from the early, I think 2000, 2002 era. And it basically just showed the parallel stories of Bill Gates and Steve Jobs. It was really interesting, though, because they introduced, during the Steve Jobs segment, a character who was very well known in technology circles, in computer circles. And I'm not necessarily a techno whiz of any type. This character named Captain Crunch. And I was able to guess when in my initial reading that this poem had something to do with this real life character named Captain Crunch, and they discussed later in the novel. But basically, he found out that there was a toy whistle that was sent out in boxes of Captain Crunch cereal, and that this whistle, when manipulated in a very easy way, could mimic exactly the tones that were used to place calls. So this guy found out a way to place calls for free using this whistle that he found in a cereal box. And for that reason, many people often credit him as one of the first hackers. And I've often found it interesting. So that was my one little iota that I was able to latch onto. Nothing else. I couldn't solve anything else. I just knew it had something to do with Captain Crunch. But we find out that he does a couple of other things to encourage his self-improvement. He uses his POV stream to broadcast something called Parzival TV. In our contemporary circle, we might call this creating a YouTube channel, which I found to be particularly interesting. And then he unfortunately takes one big step back in so much as that he broke off communication with H. And he gets into a shouting match, he says, on bottom of 203 and top of page 204 with H, accusing him of or potentially not even being able to find the copper key without his help. So in terms of his personal stake in friendship and in life, he's not doing very well. But physically and mentally, he's perhaps doing a little bit better. And lastly, on page 206, we get this really important section where he explains that no matter how frugal he tries to be, he begins to need money. And with very large bills to pay, he creates another identity, a young man named Bryce Lynch. So this is his sort of third identity. And I guess generically, in sort of superhero terms, if Parzival is Superman, Wade Watts is the sort of Clark Kent version. But I'm not sure how to classify this third identity as Bryce Lynch. He seems a little bit like Clark Kent as well. But he buys essentially a college degree and some technical certifications and becomes an Oasis programmer and developer. Despite his bogus resume, the only job he was able to get, though, is a Tier 1 technical support representative at Helpful Help Desk, one of the contract firms that Gregarious Games uses to handle Oasis customer service and support. So he's sort of lost in the service industry, a well pool, or gravity pool, if you will. But this is interesting because it enables him to go back and revisit a degree of humbleness that perhaps he had lost when he was thinking of himself as the mighty Parzival, slayer of dragons and so on and so forth. Did you find this particular section interesting or compelling in any way, Madison?
I thought it was very much like retrospective nostalgia.
Can you
for pretty much the entirety of it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so maybe this is
Because
akin to what you said earlier, maybe nostalgia for a job that he'd had, back when he was starting out. Something like that.
right, but also like, you know, people have nostalgia over like friendships, so the fighting with age.
Mm-hmm.
People remember the fights. And we know I've read ahead.
It's okay.
It's quite obvious he gets over it.
Mm-hmm.
But that's like, if that's his first major fight with somebody, you remember that.
Sure.
You're still friends when you're, you know, nostalgia overing it. You might, little old ladies who've been friends for years will tell stories and, gossip and things like that. It's just something people do.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. Again, it might be a little bit more time spent in the context of the entire novel. If it's just chapters 18, or what is it, chapters 19, 20, and 21, if it's just 3 chapters of nostalgia, then of Wade's personal nostalgia, then it doesn't feel quite as jarring in terms of the context of the novel. Yeah. And then, of course, I think that's another good point. Now, chapter 20 ends on a note. He says that when his shift as Bryce Lynch had ended, he logged out of work and immediately logged back into his Oasis account with thousands of new email messages waiting. And he writes, I could tell just by their subject lines what had happened while he had been at work. Artemis had found the Jade Key. And I think that's a relatively important part of the story because it reminds us as readers that Artemis doesn't just take that name, as a fluke or as a half-hearted selection. She is good. She is a rival in addition to a potential love interest for Wade. And I think it's really important that she is the one who discovers the second key and she gets there first. This is mirrored a little bit in the film. The contest to get the method to get the Jade Key is completely different. But she is the one who solves the puzzle, and she is the one who earns the Jade Key first, even in the film adaptation. So I was happy to see that they continued that, or carried that element over to the original text, or from the original text. Again, we should probably pause there for today. I don't want to get too much further ahead in the text in case students have not yet read. But this is an interesting section of the book because it deals not primarily with the hunt, not even necessarily with the next set of clues, but really shows how Wade develops. This is a portion of his life where he's reflecting on the transition from being an adolescent in many ways to entering the adult world and taking on some responsibilities that he had not yet come to terms with, but that he comes to terms with relatively quickly during these 6 months as the story expands. Again, I thought you had some excellent insights today, Madison. Any other thoughts about this section of the book before we wrap things up for today?
No.
Okay.
I mean, I think I pretty much pointed out. Yeah, I think pretty much what I got off of it is it's just all nostalgia.
Mm-hmm.
Just all the memories of like, I never want to be where I was back then ever again.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't want other people to make those mistakes.
Yeah. And it's interesting, as you suggest, that this entire process creates a sort of echo effect where you've got on the one hand Halliday talking about his own sort of experiences as a young man, reflecting on the culture of his period and era, and creating a written piece of material, Anorak's Almanac, for that time and space. And then you see that incorporated within our text, where Wade is writing a reflective piece about how he spent the formative years of his youth, and thinking about what context his culture and society lent to his own travails and interests. So we get this really unique sort of echo within the text in these important inter chapters. Again, those are really good.
Well, I think it's also. I think it's important to point out that every book that is like a self-biography, autobiography, when they mention another, like if they mention another biography or something that somebody's read, it's just literally perpetuating the entirety back to when written people were writing. Yeah, because you could start with, okay, pick a person alive today, and then they have reference a biography, like you said, maybe they reference Franklin.
Yeah.
Franklin wrote an autobiography. I'm sure Franklin at some point read an autobiography. It's mentioned somewhere in the book, and you just keep following it back. And you get like the cycles, like you said, of culture. But you're also getting cycles of like ethics and things like that.
Yeah.
What's important to people.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a good point. And of course, it goes without saying that even today, when we are in this arc of arts, of high fantasy in terms of films and books that sell relatively well, most of those subjects are, that succeed at the box office and in the bestseller list are of a nature that would be determined as high fantasy. And we've been riding that trajectory for quite some time now. But even in this time of high fantasy, the best-selling or most frequently selling style or genre of writing is still biography and autobiography. And I think that echoes a lot of what makes this book and its reading experience both unique and also familiar at the same time.
Right, because like Harry Potter, it's just the entirety of the books are biographies written by somebody about this kid, because it's third person. But you don't know anything that Harry doesn't know.
Right.
For the most part.
And even within, correct me if I'm wrong, but even within the context of the individual novels in the Harry Potter series, there is an extant background of literature that exists about various characters. Like I think Hermione mentions at one point that she had read the biographies of the wizards for whom the major houses are named, or something to that effect. Is that right?
Well, so that's all in Hogwarts history.
Okay. But there is
which is
yeah. Go ahead.
Which is the history of Hogwarts.
Yeah.
And essentially their founders.
So there's even
right.
So there's a biographical element even in the background of that text too.
Right.
Interesting. Okay, well, this has been, I think, a really productive discussion for today. Next week, we'll begin our discussion as about the final essay as the class kind of begins to focus on wrapping up our attention, and we're going to move into a steady stream of argumentative discussions that we will begin in our forums online. And while I won't necessarily be arguing in our lecture series, I'll introduce various ideas that I'll let students debate and argue so they can get used to that forum. But we'll have to wait for that until next week. Until then, this is Mr. Fowler signing off for today, wishing you a pleasant day and an even better tomorrow. Take care, everyone.